I was born in 1884 in Nagaoka, a provincial town that knew war long before I did. By the time I first saw America, I had already seen men die at Tsushima. I had already lost fingers to a Russian shell in 1905, watched blood soak the deck of a battleship while the sea stayed calm, indifferent. That was when I learned that war does not announce its lessons loudly. It lets you survive, and then it makes you remember. In 1919, the Imperial Japanese Navy sent me to the United States. Officially, I was a student. Unofficially, I was there to observe. I spent 2 years at Harvard, studying English and oil economics, not tactics. I crossed the country by train. I stood in stockyards in Chicago. I watched assembly lines in Detroit. I walked the docks of San Francisco and New York and counted ships without writing anything down. America did not feel like an enemy. It felt vast. It felt confident in a way Japan was not. I saw oil everywhere. Gasoline was cheap. Trucks moved without rationing. Factories worked without pause. Steel did not seem precious there, it seemed ordinary. In Japan, we planned wars around what we lacked. In America, they planned nothing around scarcity. That difference stayed with me longer than any lecture. Later, in the early 1920s, I returned again as a naval attaché in Washington. I attended dinners. I listened more than I spoke. American officers talked freely, sometimes carelessly. They assumed peace because they had never known exhaustion the way Europe and Asia had known it. But they also assumed production would solve any problem. And they were right. By the time I returned to Japan, I understood something that frightened me more than any battleship. If Japan ever fought the United States in a prolonged war, we would lose. Not because our sailors were inferior or our officers lacked courage. We would lose because courage does not refine oil, and bravery does not launch 10,000 aircraft. I said this often, too often. When I became Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet in August 1939, the war in China had already drained us. Our relations with America were tightening like a rope. The embargoes came gradually: scrap iron, aviation fuel, then oil. Each restriction was discussed in Tokyo as if it were temporary, negotiable. I knew better. I had seen American resolve form quietly, without ceremony. In meetings, I was careful with my words. Open opposition to war policy was dangerous, even for an admiral. But I said what I could, as plainly as I dared. If we fight, I told the Prime Minister and senior staff, I will run wild for 6 months. After that, I have no confidence. That sentence followed me. It was quoted, reshaped, simplified. What I meant was not bravado. I meant that 6 months was the limit of what surprise, training, and spirit could buy us. After that, America's industry would wake fully. And when it did, it would not sleep again. In 1940, Germany's victories in Europe intoxicated Tokyo. France fell. The British retreated at Dunkirk. Many believed the Western powers were hollow, that one decisive blow could shatter them. I did not share that belief. I had walked through American cities at night. I had seen their lights stretch to the horizon. Still, plans moved forward without me asking for them. By 1941, war was no longer a question of if, only how. The Army pressed south. The Navy was expected to make it possible. Negotiations with Washington dragged on, each side speaking past the other. I read the summaries carefully. They sounded like men already resigned to violence, pretending otherwise. When I was ordered to prepare a plan against the United States Pacific Fleet, I understood the weight of it immediately. A direct, traditional war would destroy us. Only one path remained: to strike first, with enough force to buy time. Time to fortify. Time to secure resources. Time that, even then, I suspected we would waste. Pearl Harbor was not conceived out of confidence. It was conceived out of fear. We trained in secrecy. Carrier aviation became the sharp edge of the fleet. The Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, Zuikaku, 6 carriers, the finest concentration of naval air power Japan would ever possess. Pilots trained until exhaustion, then trained again. There was no room for error, because there would be no second chance. As the months passed, I felt the distance between my duty and my understanding widen. I did not believe in the war. But I believed in responsibility. If the nation chose this path, then the fleet would walk it with discipline, not illusion. In late November 1941, as the task force sailed from Hitokapu Bay under radio silence, I remained behind. That is a detail many forget. I did not lead the strike in person. My place was with the combined fleet, coordinating what would follow. Still, every calculation, every risk, had my mark on it. On December 7th, when the reports began to arrive, they were precise and cold. Battleships burning. Aircraft destroyed on the ground. Losses lighter than expected. Tactically, it was a success. Strategically, I felt no relief. I knew what we had done. We had awakened an enemy I had spent years trying to understand and years trying to avoid. And the 6 months had begun. By January 1942, the Pacific felt suddenly small. Reports arrived daily, sometimes hourly, from places I had studied only on charts before the war. Guam fell quickly. Wake resisted longer than expected, and that resistance troubled me more than its eventual capture reassured me. Even small garrisons, when determined, consumed time. Time was the only thing we did not possess. The Philippines became the next test. General MacArthur's forces withdrew toward Bataan and Corregidor, just as we had predicted. From Tokyo, the newspapers spoke of inevitable collapse. From my desk, the reports were less triumphant. Our pilots were flying constantly. Aircraft wore down faster than they could be replaced. Experienced crews were already irreplaceable, though few wanted to hear that. The southern operation unfolded with speed that surprised even us. Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, names that fell one after another. Singapore's surrender in February was celebrated as proof that Western power in Asia had been a facade. I did not share that conclusion. Britain had been fighting for its life in Europe for years. America had not yet truly begun. Oil fields in Borneo and Sumatra were seized largely intact. This was supposed to be the solution to everything. But oil in the ground is not fuel in a tank. Refineries needed repair. Tankers needed escort. Every mile of ocean between those fields and Japan was now a vulnerability we had created for ourselves. By March, the fleet was stretched thin across a perimeter too wide to defend properly. Success had expanded our responsibilities faster than our capacity. The men did not complain. Sailors rarely do, until they can no longer stand. But I read fatigue in the numbers. Maintenance delays, training hours reduced, pilots rotated too slowly because there were no replacements ready. I was expected to be satisfied. I was not. In private conferences, I began to speak of the inevitable counterstroke. America would not accept defeat in the Pacific. Their pride would not allow it, and their resources made resistance possible. The question was not whether they would strike back, but where, and whether we could force a decisive battle before their strength matured. That was when Midway began to take shape in my mind. Midway was a speck of land, barely visible on a map. But it sat like a door hinge between Hawaii and the Western Pacific. If we could draw the American carriers out and destroy them, the war might be decided early. It was a desperate logic, but desperation was now our constant companion. Some of my staff objected. The plan was complex. Too many moving parts. Too much reliance on surprise. They were correct. But there was no simpler path left. Defensive war favored America. Only an offensive gamble offered even a chance. Before Midway, there was the Coral Sea. In May 1942, our carriers met the enemy's carriers for the first time without seeing each other. Aircraft fought aircraft across empty water. It was a strange battle, impersonal and disorienting. We lost Shoho. The Americans lost Lexington. On paper, the exchange favored us. In reality, it revealed something dangerous. American pilots were learning quickly. Their losses did not slow them the way ours slowed us. They could absorb damage and return with repaired ships and new crews. We could not. Every pilot lost was a wound that did not heal. After Coral Sea, I knew the 6 months were nearly gone. In June, the Midway operation began. I remained with the main body, hundreds of miles away, relying on reports delayed by hours. The plan assumed precision and luck in equal measure. We had less of both than we believed. When the messages arrived, they were fragmented at first. Air strikes launched. Unexpected resistance. Then silence. And then the words no commander wishes to read. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, burning. Then Hiryu. 4 fleet carriers, lost in a single morning. I read the report slowly, more than once. There was no shock left in me. Only confirmation. The battle had not merely cost us ships. It had cost us the initiative, and with it, any remaining illusion of control. The pilots who survived were fewer than we could afford to lose. The aircrews that had trained for years were gone in minutes. America, wounded but not broken, now held the advantage that mattered most: time. After Midway, the war entered a different phase, though many refused to admit it. Official statements spoke of temporary setbacks. I spoke of endurance, of attrition, of preparing for a long struggle we were not built to win. Privately, I thought back to my days in America. The factories, the railroads, the endless fuel. I realized that the 6 months had not been a prediction. They had been a deadline. And we had passed it. By August 1942, the maps in my headquarters began to change color. Guadalcanal was not supposed to matter. A strip of jungle, an unfinished airfield, heat and disease. But when American Marines landed there on August 7th, I understood immediately what they were doing. They were not advancing recklessly. They were anchoring themselves. They were learning how to fight us on equal terms, and they chose the ground carefully. Henderson Field became the center of everything. Whoever controlled it controlled the air by day, and whoever controlled the sea by night paid for it in blood. We still excelled in night surface combat. Our cruisers and destroyers moved with discipline and precision. But night victories did not build air superiority. They only delayed its loss. The Tokyo Express began, destroyers running supplies down the slot at night, unloading under pressure, withdrawing before dawn. It was a clever adaptation. It was also an admission of weakness. We were feeding an army with warships, burning fuel we could not replace, risking crews we could not spare. Each night action carried a cost. Tassafaranga, Cape Esperance, Savo Island. The names blurred together, but the pattern was clear. We could still strike hard, still kill efficiently, but every engagement thinned us. Every veteran lost took experience with him that no training program could recreate. American losses hurt them. Our losses hollowed us. I visited forward bases when I could. I spoke to aircrew commanders, listened to their reports without interruption. They spoke of worn engines, of pilots flying multiple sorties a day, of spare parts cannibalized from wrecks. No one complained openly. But they did not need to. Their eyes said enough. In Tokyo, the situation was described as fluid. In reality, it was grinding us down. By autumn, Guadalcanal had become a test of endurance rather than skill. The Americans rotated units. Fresh divisions replaced exhausted ones. Their logistics improved month by month. Ours deteriorated. Malaria, dysentery, starvation. These were not dramatic deaths, but they emptied battalions as effectively as artillery. I requested withdrawal more than once. Each time, the response was cautious, delayed, or non-committal. To abandon ground was politically dangerous. To continue fighting for it was militarily disastrous. We chose the latter because it was easier to justify. By November, the decision was finally made. Evacuation, not victory, became the objective. Operation K was executed with precision. Tens of thousands were pulled out under cover of darkness. It was a success, technically. Strategically, it marked something irreversible. We were no longer advancing. We were managing defeat. After Guadalcanal, my role changed subtly. I was still commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, but my authority narrowed. Decisions increasingly flowed from Tokyo downward, shaped by hope rather than fact. I provided assessments. They were acknowledged, then quietly ignored. I spent more time traveling, to Rabaul, to Truk. I believed commanders should be seen. Morale could not be maintained by radio alone. Some of my staff worried about the risk. I dismissed it. Risk had become ordinary. In early 1943, I knew the Americans were hunting me. That was no secret. My movements were predictable. My presence mattered symbolically. Removing me would not change the war's outcome, but it would serve their narrative. I accepted that. On April 17th, I finalized an inspection schedule in the Solomons. It was routine. Precise times. Exact locations. I insisted on punctuality. Discipline, even now, mattered. The next morning, April 18, 1943, I boarded a Mitsubishi G4M bomber at Rabaul. The aircraft was lightly armored, vulnerable, but it had range. We took off as scheduled. The sea below was calm. The sky was clear. I did not know, then, that American codebreakers had read our messages. I did not know that fighters had been dispatched specifically for me. But I understood the war well enough to sense when events were converging. As we approached Bougainville, I reviewed reports in my mind. Carrier losses. Pilot shortages. Production figures. Everything pointed in the same direction. The end was not near, but it was inevitable. The bomber maintained course. Escorts flanked us. For a moment, there was only engine noise and open water. Then the warning came, too late to matter. The escort broke formation first. I remember the change in engine note before I saw anything. An abrupt rise, then gunfire tearing through the quiet that had settled inside the aircraft. Someone shouted from the cockpit. Another voice answered, clipped and formal, as if discipline could still impose order on what was already unfolding. American fighters came out of the sun. Later, they would call it a calculated interception. At the time, it felt like inevitability finally catching up. Tracers crossed the air in short, controlled bursts. The G4M shuddered. Its fuel tanks were unprotected. We all knew that. Everyone who flew in them knew it. Range had been chosen over survival long before this morning. I did not move. There was nowhere to move to. The first rounds struck the wing. Fire followed almost immediately. The smell was sharp, chemical, overwhelming. The aircraft began to lose altitude, not violently at first, but with the steady certainty of something no longer supported. I thought, briefly, of the officers who had warned me not to travel. I thought of the message schedules I had approved myself. Precision had always been my habit. It had served me well. It had also made me predictable. There was no panic among the crew. They did what they had been trained to do, even though training offered no solution. The escorts were gone now, driven off or destroyed. The bomber was alone. As the aircraft descended toward the jungle, I felt no fear. That surprised me. What I felt was completion. A sense that my part in this war had already been spoken, and that the remaining words no longer required me to be present. The trees rose quickly. Then there was impact. I did not see the end of the war. But I had already seen its shape. In Tokyo, they would announce my death with ceremony. There would be photographs, statements about sacrifice and duty. I would be promoted posthumously, as tradition required. For a time, my name would be used to stiffen resolve. It would not change anything. The fleet would continue to fight, with courage and diminishing means. Young pilots would replace dead ones, trained faster, knowing less. Ships would sail with thinner escorts. Fuel would be rationed until operations became impossible. The Americans would come back again and again, each time stronger, each time more certain. I had warned them once. Quietly. Repeatedly. Not as a prophet, but as a man who had walked the factories and rail yards of our future enemy and understood what patience backed by industry looked like. 6 months. That was never a boast. It was a confession. After my death, the war did not pause. It never does. The fleet continued to operate according to plans already weakened by loss and compromise. New commanders assumed my duties. They were capable men, loyal men. None of them inherited more ships, more fuel, or more trained pilots than I had left behind. Authority cannot manufacture resources. It can only decide how quickly they are spent. In the months that followed, the Americans advanced deliberately. Not recklessly, not emotionally. Island by island, they tested our defenses, measured resistance, bypassed what was unnecessary, and destroyed what could not be ignored. Their carriers returned in greater numbers than before. Their aircraft appeared newer, faster, flown by crews who survived mistakes and learned from them. We did not. In the Central Pacific, our garrisons waited as they had been ordered to do. They waited without hope of reinforcement, without evacuation plans, without illusion. On Tarawa, on Saipan, on Peleliu, men fought until there was no one left to report. The sea and the sand absorbed them without comment. From Tokyo, the language hardened. Losses were described as opportunities. Setbacks became trials of spirit. I had heard that language before, in different forms, during earlier wars. It never changed outcomes. It only changed how they were explained. What I had understood in America was not strategy. It was scale. War between nations is not decided by bravery alone, nor by a single battle, no matter how decisive it appears. It is decided by what a country can replace and what it cannot. Pilots take years. Engineers take years. Ships take years. Oil takes geography and peace. America possessed these things in depth. Japan did not. By late 1943, the window I had spoken of was long closed. There were no 6 months left to gamble with. Only time to endure, and to lose men in ways that could no longer influence the outcome. The fleet still existed on paper. In reality, it was already a shadow, its sharp edge worn down by necessity and delay. I am sometimes remembered as a contradiction, a man who planned Pearl Harbor while doubting the war it began. That is not a contradiction. It is the condition of duty. Once the decision was made above me, my responsibility was not to debate it endlessly, but to execute it as cleanly as possible, to spare what could be spared, to delay what could not be stopped. History prefers clarity. War does not provide it. If my warning is remembered at all, it is often shortened to a sentence. 6 months. As if war obeys calendars. What I meant was simpler and more difficult to accept. Surprise fades. Courage bleeds out. Industry endures. I had seen that endurance with my own eyes long before the first bomb fell. When the war finally ended in August 1945, it did so not with fleets meeting at sea, but with cities erased and a nation exhausted beyond denial. By then, no warning was needed. The evidence lay everywhere, in ruins and silence. I did not live to see that end. But I had already understood it. That understanding was never secret. It was merely inconvenient. And so the war went on without me, as it would have, with or without any single man.